today to talk a little bit more about area. So yesterday we kind of introduced area and we figured out how to draw rectangles with a given area. Today we're going to talk about if the area is already there, how can we figure out what it is? We're going to look at a couple of different ways. So you need to have your workbook and make sure that you turn to page 771. If you don't have your workbook, go ahead and hit pause, go grab it, and then come back. Okay, so area is the number of square units needed to cover a figure without overlapping. So if I had, oops, there we go. If I had this square and each one of these squares was overlapped, the area of that shape would be 4 square units because there's 4 whole shapes. However, and that's kind of what we did yesterday. We talked about whole squares. That's all that we covered. However, sometimes your shape doesn't have whole squares. Sometimes you might have half square units, and they might look like this, or one of these two. And when you have a half square unit, you can't ignore it. You have to count it. So how do we do that? Well, we know that 2 halves make 1 whole. So anytime that you're counting, you're going to start out by counting your whole squares, then count your half squares. And for every 2 halves, you add 1 to your whole. Does that sound crazy? Let's look at an example. Okay, example 1. In art class, Haley drew the figure at the right on the grid paper. So she drew this picture right here. What is the area of the figure that Haley drew? Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is count how many whole squares are there. So this whole bottom row and then this little part right here are whole squares. Let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I like to put dots in the squares as I count them so that way I know I already counted them. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So there are 14 whole squares. Okay, now we need to count the half squares. And I like to make circles around my half squares so that it's really easy to see where they are. So here's a half, and there's a half, okay? You can see they kind of did this down below. There's all of your whole squares, and then there's the half squares, okay? So then we think about adding those two numbers together. So I have 14 whole squares and 2 half squares. Well, I know that 2 half squares equals 1 whole. So if I add my 14 whole and then the 1 from my 2 halves, that means there are 15 whole squares, and the area of that shape is 15 square units. Remember we talked yesterday that square units are the type of measurement. Instead of saying inches or feet, square units tells me the inside of a shape. All right, hopefully that made sense, but let's try another. Let's practice some more. Go ahead and turn your page to 772. And let's look at example number 2, okay? It says sometimes the units on drawings represent another unit of measurement. So this is what we call a geoboard, okay? And when you have something like this where the squares aren't easy to see, I always like to go ahead and draw my lines so that I can see my squares. So I'm gonna, whoops.
LSIC meeting is now being held in the library. LSIC is now being held in the library.
Okay, so I drew my lines to make it a little bit easier to see. So now let's count our whole squares. Okay, count the number of whole squares. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 8 whole squares in there. Now, I remember I like to circle my half squares so that it's a little bit easier to see them, okay? So there are also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 half squares. Okay, so So remember, each time I have two halves, it equals one whole. So these two would make a whole. These two are a whole. These two make a whole, and these two make a whole. So I have 8 whole squares, and then 8 half squares, but that equals 4 wholes. So 8 plus 4 equals 12. So the area of that kind of crazy looking shape is 12 square units, okay? So that's what you're gonna practice today. You're gonna practice counting how many whole shapes are there, count how many half shapes there are, and then add those two together to figure out the area of the figure.